was the summer after school had finished, when I finally found myself a decent paying job. It wasn't the finest place to work, but I needed cash, having spent most of it on road trips, where I did nothing but party for days. The shop was small, and it turned out that I was the only staff available for the night shift. I settled down well enough, thanks to my manager Mark. He was a nice guy, always smiling, helpful, and never once had I seen him angry. I remember a week back when a customer started getting heated, some steroid-jacked asshole whose card declined at the till. I tried telling him that I couldn't just let him off this one time, but then he grabbed my collar and started cursing at me. Hearing the commotion, Mark came up to the customer and politely asked him to release me. Naturally, the juicehead didn't, so Mark put a hand on his shoulder, which earned him a punch to the face. A punch like that should have knocked out a scrawny guy like Mark, but instead, blood gushing from his nose, he straightened up and asked the guy to leave, showing no pain or emotion. At that, the customer left quietly, all the while being dumbfounded. Mark nodded at me and went back to his back room, as if nothing had happened. So yeah, aside from the extreme work hours and the occasional asshole, the job wasn't too bad. It was the second week of working there, that Sunday, a slower day than usual. Normally on Sunday nights, there'd be a decent amount of people lining up to buy drinks, except today. The first customer didn't arrive until 2 a.m., just under halfway through my shift. He was strange, to say the least. He wore nothing but an oversized hoodie, which thankfully covered the top half of his legs. He seemed alert. His eyes darted around like a pinball machine. I thought he was high or something, although it wasn't uncommon to see in my shifts. He disappeared somewhere over in the third aisle, before the doors were abruptly barged open again. A second guy came in, wearing a business suit, hair slicked back, and stinking of cologne. A late-night worker like me, but working a job that quadrupled my salary. He ignored me. Clearly I wasn't worth paying attention to, and instead he headed over to the alcohol section. I didn't see the hooded person for a while, so I watched YouTube. Suddenly, there was a crash from outside, like metal slamming against metal. The backroom door opened, and Mark came out. "You should check that out," he said. "I'll work the till for a minute." I went out to investigate, trudging along the parking lot. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I noticed the overturned bins where a family of foxes were having a feast. I went back to the store. I wasn't paid enough to do anything about it. Taking over from Mark, who went back, I attended to the businessman, who didn't let me scan the products. Instead, he threw a wad of cash, deftly leaving with a bottle of Jameson's. There was another crashing sound, but I ignored it, thinking it was the foxes again. That's when the guy with the hoodie came into sight again, this time with a grin and a large jug of bleach in his hand. Before he could even make it to the counter, he spewed up a tide of vomit, splashing around his bare feet and all over the aisle. He fell unconscious, spilling the bleach. Groaning, I took up a mop and went over to clean up. Pulling the man over to another aisle, I got to work against the stain, grimacing as I recognized the smell of piss. After about 10 minutes, I'd finished up most of the floor. Then I went over to check the bumper clot. Except he wasn't there. I looked around the store for a while, but no, nothing. I went back to my station, where sure enough Mark sat. "Did somebody leave?" I asked. He didn't look too good. "No, nobody's come in or left yet," Mark replied, looking a little puzzled. "You cleaned up the floor?" "Yes." With that, Mark left, and I finished off the next 3 hours of my shift. Occasionally, I'd hear the thumping again, but thought nothing of it. Finally, I was home and went straight to sleep. I awoke to furious knocking on the door. I scrambled to my feet and doubled back when I saw 2 police officers. They introduced themselves and asked if they could interview me. There had been disappearances around the area, and investigations hadn't uncovered anything. They wanted to know if I knew anything about them, and sure enough, things became familiar to me. Missing people like the steroid head a week ago, or the businessman, and the hooded guy. There were other missing customers as well, and eventually, I asked them if they were questioning Mark too. They stopped. "Who's Mark?" they asked. The manager. He works the same shifts as I do. "We've checked the company records. There ain't no Mark on there. Only you." After a while of exchanging words, they put me into a police cruiser and drove to the store. They told me to show them where Mark was. A vague request, and I prayed that he was in today. So far, I knew that I looked like the prime suspect, and only Mark could confirm that I was not involved. I led them to the backroom door and knocked. No response. I knocked a little harder. Still nothing. The police took over, kicking the door down and switching on the light. The horror before us would be something that would never leave my mind. I retched uncontrollably as the stench overpowered me. Stacked up against the far wall were piles of bodies mixed in with each other. Some of them were headless, others missing limbs. The buzz of flies was deafening. The officers cuffed me, quickly whisking me away to the police station. My trial's set to be soon, and as it stands, I'm going to jail. They filed through records, pictures, footage. I was the only one ever seen. But I swear to God, Mark was there. He always was, and I don't care if they call me crazy, because even in the dead of night, in my cell, I can see him in the corner of the room. I lived in suburban Tokyo for a while. It was a quiet little place with quiet little people and quiet little rumors that seemed to spread like wildfire. Of unfaithful spouses and noisy neighbors, the place only ever seemed lively whenever something scandalous happened, which would be the topic of conversation for the week before another rumor would inevitably come around. Our family was subject to this treatment the day we moved in from the countryside. Whenever they were around us, they would shake our hands and congratulate us, but the moment they thought we were out of earshot, words such as bumpkin and yokel would find their way to us in hushed whispers. Regardless, we found a way to pay rent for our overpriced one-bedroom flat, and even to fund me to go to a prestigious private school. There was nothing more important than my well-being and education. My parents worked hard to ensure that I did not go hungry or wanting, while they were pushed to the extremes, often finding them passed out on the couch before their next 12-hour shift. I thought it was all unfair, but more often than not, they would simply reply with nothing but scorn, saying that working hard was part of the process, something that I took to heart for the rest of my life. School was nothing but torture. From the moment I stepped foot, I knew that I was different. Like the neighborhood, it was nothing but murmurs. I sat alone in every class, and the library became my second home, endorsed in reading or studying for the next exam, while everyone sat in their groups, throwing quick glances my way, whispering and then laughing aloud. The second month was worse. They took any opportunity to make my life a living hell, wrecking my desk, breaking my locker, while any attempt to appeal to a teacher was met by nothing but stony silence. A curse of some sorts had come over me. Once, another boy decided to talk to me, which lasted for a grand total of a minute before he became self-conscious of all the judgment. I became the outcast, the excommunicated one. I realized then that I was truly alone. and that for at least a few years I'd have to endure. My parents' words never left me, and I racked up A's on my tests as terms went by. I had to move away from the library eventually. There were too many people, too many chances to make fun of me. I locked myself up in the school toilets instead, where I found a little more peace, paging through books and notes until break was over. And it was in those toilets on that fateful day that I met her. I was quite tense. For some reason, I felt as if something was watching me. I struggled to focus, numbers and letters becoming all but nonsense to me. Within a few minutes, I was already drowsy, my mouth dry. Opening the stall, I looked left and right, saw no one, and walked to the basin where I splashed my face with water. I looked in the mirror for a while. I thought things that I thought I would never have to contemplate, about how my parents' lives would be so much easier if I disappeared. I retreated back into the stall and felt the tears flowing freely. Suddenly, I felt a hand upon my shoulder, and I feared the worst, that there was some other kid who found me crying, that the bullying would intensify. Only it was even worse. I looked up to see a girl in a white shroud, bloody handprints across the dress, lank black hair, so long it tickled my cheeks. I could only stammer, frozen, unwilling to move. Her hand gripped harder, to the point at which my shoulder began to ache, but I was too scared to move. She spoke in an ethereal voice that seemed halfway between reality and a dream. Her words didn't seem material.
Tell me why you are here?
I didn't reply.
Why are you crying? You are sad?
I nodded, fixing my gaze on the stall door behind her, calculating, reading if I could escape.
I can make all your problems disappear.
No, you can't. No, this isn't real. This is all just a dream. Go away, demon! Stay back!
I kept yelling and screaming, and then shut my eyes tight, tears threatening to drop. Looking back up, there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I picked up my bag and looked around the room.
Make my problems go away, please.
The day went by. I dragged myself home, opening the door to an empty house. My parents wouldn't be back until morning. Like clockwork, I made myself dinner, studied, and went to bed again. It was all routine. Outside, the wind howled a little louder. The next day, I noticed something. The usual kids who bullied me were nowhere to be seen. The day went a little smoother than usual. Not being paranoid of a beating around every corner did that to you. I went home, made myself dinner, studied, and went to bed again. Again, the same. The next day, as the homeroom teacher read out names, half the class seemed gone. In the middle of maths, a worried parent came barging into the room, beckoning for the teacher. There were words of anger outside. I went home, made myself dinner, studied, and went to bed again. The third day, an assembly was called. Students had gone missing, all in one night. We were to be escorted to school until further notice. Of course, I had no one to escort me, but I'd be fine. Rumors circulated, rumors again, rumors that I was responsible for the students going missing. However, that wasn't the case, as rumors aren't always true. But I knew who was responsible, and she kept me company. I see her always, dancing across the floor in the blood-stained dress that sways in the wind. Grandfather always sits near the fireplace, looking into the embers for hours at a time. This has become like second nature to him. Any day, any hour, he'd be sitting dead still in that armchair, eyes empty. The crackling of the wood, the only sound in the room. I always hated going to my grandfather's place for this reason, but I finally knew why he was always like that when I asked my mother. I figured it wasn't a topic that she was particularly happy to talk about, but she knew it was about time I was told. Taking my hand, we went downstairs, and she carefully shook my grandfather's shoulder. As if he had been slumbering for years, he jerked his eyes wide open, and he looked around the room frantically, hands shaking. After calming down a bit, his eyes focused on me. My mother nudged me gently. I gulped and asked what had happened to him. Hearing these words, a little colour returned to his skin, but he still looked as frail as ever. Eyes darting to every corner of the room, he opened his mouth and began to speak. It was December 1914. The First World War was in full motion, and across Europe, battles were fought furiously. My grandfather had just arrived in France from England. He spoke of how the land was no longer recognizable. It was just a muddy landscape with craters and flooded with rainwater. The stench was unbearable, and seeing the wounded in makeshift tents screaming in pain scared him. But he felt safe knowing that his comrades were around him, in equal awe of the horror. When they reached the trenches, it was Christmas Eve. Night had already fallen, and it was all but silent. Huddled around a campfire, they watched the distant bombs fall, creating small orange bursts in the skyline. There was small chatter about what was going on back at home. The older lot, desperate to hear news from the newer guys. Every now and then, the sound of gunfire would stop the conversations, before they started again. The guys suddenly decided to brighten up the mood with a little Christmas carol. Silent night filled the trenches, one voice at a time, until a steady orchestra had begun. Then across in no man's land, the Germans joined in their native tongue. For a while, both sides took turns in singing different Christmas tunes, until an officer came around and hushed up the men, claiming it was fraternization with the enemy. They fell into their sleeping holes not long after, but my grandfather had different plans. At the dead of night, he climbed over the top and began to make his way across to the Germans. He was confident that they were friendly folk, and he wanted none other than to make some new friends, however unlikely. Just in case, he brought his rifle with him. He reached the German trenches, where it was just as eerily quiet. Pitch black. It was difficult to make out any shapes. That's when my grandfather accidentally tripped over, creating a ruckus as he did. Worried, he stood himself up again, scanning with his rifle. Nothing. A dripping sound was all he could hear, making a steady rhythm. He began to walk, using his hands to navigate in the dark. All of a sudden, there was a sobbing sound. He began to walk faster towards it. Eventually, he came across a German soldier laying in a fetal position, hands over his ears. Crouching, my grandfather shook him by the shoulders, but he made no sound other than whispering.
Nein, ungeheuer.
Just then, there was a crackling noise from behind, like bones twisting against each other. It was sickening to hear. The German screamed. My grandfather turned around, rifle raised. It had no face, just a skull. Inches away, fetid, foul. It wasn't human. Limbs bent at uneven angles, its hand reaching out. Blood flooded from where its eyes would have been. Just then, my grandfather began to shake unbearably. His lips quivered. The glass of medicine in his hand dropped. My mother shooed me upstairs, closing the door behind. The last sight I saw was the froth building up in his mouth. I clambered upstairs, scared of what I had heard. I turned the knob to my bedroom.
I was 16 and we met on Facebook. He went to a school nearby, and we decided to meet up for a movie. We had a great time together and ended up dating. First time he came to my parents' house, he had an ankle monitor on for house arrest, and wouldn't tell anyone why. Red flag number 1. And since he was a minor, we couldn't find out. My parents obviously didn't allow us to hang out, so we hung out at his house or around town, at the YMCA camp. I was rebellious and naive. Things started to get weird when I noticed his family was pretty odd. One day we were doing it in his bedroom, and I saw his father looking in through the blinds. I screamed and called him out, and his dad ran off. The stalker guy told me that his dad was just into redheads and liked to watch us, so this wasn't the first time. I went to leave, and his mum was doing crack in the kitchen, so I decided it was time to break up, and this is when things got bad. He started crying and told me that he's in cancer treatment, and that's why he needs me. He doesn't have long to live. I believed him and told him we could be friends. This is when the stalking started. He switched schools to my high school, but never went to class. He would just stand outside my classroom looking inside until it was passing period. When I would leave class, he wouldn't address me. He would just follow, about 10 to 15 feet behind me to my next period, and stand outside the classroom again. I was too intimidated to say something to him, as he was 6'4" and heavy set, so I just let it happen for a few weeks. It started to progress when he would follow me home every day. He would get on the same bus as me, despite living across town, and walk 10 to 15 feet behind me all the way to my house. He would stand outside, just staring up at the window, until around the time my parents got home, and then he would just leave. Finally, I told him to piss off and leave me alone. I told him we could no longer be friends or acquaintances or anything, and to forget about me. However, that escalated things way further. I started getting about 150 calls a night. Half of them were him screaming death threats and in detail torture methods that he wanted to do to me, and the other half were him singing me love songs that he wrote on his guitar. Every time I blocked his number, he seemed to just magically get a new one and leave more messages on that. I woke up one day to see that overnight he had left me one of these dancing, singing snowmen on my porch. He had stabbed it in the head, and the knife was sticking out. He covered it in his liquid deodorant that I had previously mentioned liking the smell of, and I noticed that there was a hole where the little song recording device was. When I pressed the hand, it was not the regular Frosty the Snowman song that played. It was his voice singing eerily, "I'm gonna have you forever. I'm never gonna let you go." I was done at this point and told my parents, who contacted the school. They suspended him, but he still waited at my bus stop every day and walked to my home with me. One day he ran at me, like he was gonna tackle me. When I tensed up for the impact, he stopped and hugged me. It wasn't a regular hug, it was like he was trying to crush me. I was 5'1" and about 90 pounds at the time, and he ended up cracking one of my ribs. I cried and he started crying too before running off, and he left me a voicemail apologizing in song. This one night is the night I'll never forget, and it's the reason why we got a restraining order and my dad got a gun. I woke up one evening for no reason. I was just fully awake. I got up to go to my kitchen to get a glass of water and relax, and in the reflection on my fridge I saw movement in the backyard. I couldn't see well because it was so dark outside and so light inside, so I went to the back sliding glass door to get a better look. When I got closer, I was met with the silhouette of a 6'4" man standing just outside the door. The stalker guy was standing in my backyard under my room at 3 a.m. He was just staring at me. I yelled at my parents and got them up, but of course he was gone by the time my dad got outside. There's a patio right outside my bedroom window that goes all the way around to the ground, so it's possible he could have been on top of the patio looking directly into my bedroom window before. We got a restraining order granted shortly after, and stalker guy dropped out of school. I haven't seen him in person, but every 6 months-ish, he makes a new Facebook and tries to friend request me. I block and report it every time. Have you ever heard that myth that if you wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, there's likely someone looking at you? Well, maybe it's true.